When I started doing dyes, plant dyes, lichen dyes, I didn't know anything. I jumped in and just started doing it.
Something very old. Maybe a Cortinarius? I don't know.
Well, the gills don't look dark enough, is it?
Try it and see. That was a constant response from my mom, Dorothy Beebee, while I was growing up and wanted to know how to do stuff. Little did I know it wasn't just something mom said to daughters, but rather an ideal rooted in how she lived her life. That was also the mindset of the late Miriam Rice, who first discovered in the 1970s that mushrooms could be a source of natural dyes. She wrote a short book about her experiments, and my mom illustrated it with drawings of the various mushrooms she used. And what started as a simple illustration job grew into a decades-long friendship and collaboration of discovering and sharing how mushrooms could provide a virtually limitless source of natural color. Mushroom dye experiments are now easily shared online with a few easy clicks and a photo. But it all began 50 years ago with excited phone calls and letters between a small group of women detailing their newest discoveries. And I want the history of how it began to be remembered. For it was the discovery of one curious woman, aided by a small group of friends, including her trusted and just as curious sidekick illustrator, who first documented how to dye with mushrooms. Their tenacity paved the way for the dyers of today. I'm the sidekick's daughter. This is her story. In the late 1950s and 60s, my mom started making fiber art projects and learned how to spin her own yarn.
And so I had all of this yarn that I was spinning, all of this wool, and I wanted to learn how to color it. And so I figured that if I'm using hand-spun yarn, I should use natural dyes with it. And I wanted to do little mini tapestries with just using natural colors. And so I went to the library to see if I could find any books about natural dyes. And there was only one book there. It was a little pamphlet that was been written back in the 30s and was put out by the Department of Agriculture. And it was about natural dyes. And so I checked that out. And I learned that I could use things as simply as onion skins or carrot tops, or go out in the field and pick flowers and whatever like that. So that's what I started with, was onion skins. And then I would go around walking in the park or out in the fields, or if we went to the country, and picking things and boiling them up to see what kind of colors I could get. I knew some things to look for, but basically I was just picking whatever I could find. I can remember going to the beach and seeing this beautiful red, dark maroon, wine-colored red seaweed and wondering if that would make a dye, and collecting a bunch of it and bringing it home. This was when I was first living in San Francisco, 1959. And I was doing my little experiments. And so that's a seaweed that I boiled up. I think I'll make a dye into. It did not make a dye, and it made the most awful smell that the landlady from the apartment house came down, banged on my door, and said, "Please stop whatever you're doing and don't ever do it again."
In the 1960s, though they didn't know each other, Miriam and my mom were living parallel paths only a few hours from one another. Miriam was an artist on the Northern California coast in Mendocino, and teacher at the Mendocino Arts Center. But while my mom was experimenting with wildflowers and seaweed in San Francisco, Miriam tried a little yellow mushroom.
One of the classes she was teaching was a children's class in making natural dyes, which she called it her garbage dyes, from carrot tops, onion skins, all the basic things that I had started out with many, many years ago too. And one day when she was out collecting, she found these bright little yellow mushrooms, and just on a whim threw those into a dye pot with some yarn, and she got a brilliant color, and that's how she got started.
My mom was also working as a professional illustrator and agreed to illustrate a book by the owner of the local yarn shop on Warping a Loom, a perfect union of her skills as an illustrator and her love of fiber arts. In 1971, my parents and brother Martin moved from San Francisco 2 hours north to Monterey, a small town in Sonoma County's Russian River Valley. And she found a publisher for the book.
The publishers of the book, Christine and Robert Thresh, who were spinners and dyers themselves and had published several books on natural dyes and on spinning, on hand spinning with a drop spindle, told me that a woman had come in to their office showing them some samples of natural dyes that had been made with mushrooms. And they told her that they really wanted to publish her little book and told her to go home and write a book about it. And they wanted a drawing of one mushroom. I said, sure, why not? And they took me up to Mendocino, California, to meet Miriam Rice. And we hit it off immediately. And I saw all the work that she had done, and I was absolutely entranced.
One of the hallmarks of the 1960s was a growing environmental awareness, and fiber artists were looking for alternatives to traditional aniline dyes, which are derived from coal tar and known to be toxic.
She wanted something that was safer to use than the aniline dyes, and that's why she became interested in using natural dyes. And this was during the 60s, so there was a lot of resurgence during that period of interest in the old way of doing things. A lot of people were doing natural dyes, plant dyes, all around. And that's really how the mushroom dyes got started.
While there was a growing interest in using plants for natural dyes, it seemed no one had thought to try mushrooms. It was an untapped source.
Miriam had researched everything she could find to see if there had been anything written anywhere about anyone using mushrooms for dyes. And the only thing we found was that in Scandinavia, many, many, many years ago, that some of the Scandinavians had used some tree polypore for a yellow dye, but that was referenced in an old reference book, and that's all we knew. So it was really a first.
My mom began working closely with Miriam on the book, and what started out as a job to illustrate one mushroom turned into a project to illustrate everything Miriam had done. But Miriam continued experimenting with new mushrooms, and my mom started doing more than just drawing them. She began collecting mushrooms herself, trying to identify them, and doing her own experiments.
It turned out that I started documenting what Miriam was doing. You know, I could subtitle the whole thing, Trying to Keep Up with Miriam. And I was doing the mushroom dyes at the same time, following her directions, so that I could duplicate what she was doing and try and use the same mushrooms that she was doing. And at the same time, I was keeping in touch with Miriam, and she told me what kind of mushrooms that she wanted to have drawings done. And Martin and I would go out into the woods, and we would start picking mushrooms. And Martin, at 5 years old, was pretty close to the ground, and so he was finding all the really good mushrooms. But I had had a lot of experience in doing natural dyes. So I knew about using mordants. I knew the proper procedures for doing a dye and for keeping notes. And from the very beginning, I started keeping very careful notes of everything I was doing to document the drawings I was doing and then the experiments I was doing. Having the experience as a scientific illustrator and also in drawing, and just in drawing plants, you learn to observe. And you learn what to look for, what features to look for, what features to emphasize. And that was very important.
Since neither of them had a formal background in mycology, they needed help verifying the identification of the mushrooms they were using, and began making connections with local mushroom enthusiasts.
I started going down to the San Francisco Mycological Society's meetings in Golden Gate Park. And I would take mushrooms down there with me to get them identified. And when we found some really good dye mushrooms that we had no idea what they were, I contacted the advisor for the Mycological Society, Dr. Harry Tiers, made an appointment with him at San Francisco State to take my drawings down and to get them identified, ones that we knew made good dyes. And he was very, very helpful. And that's how I got a lot of the drawings identified. I was pleased that he could identify the mushroom from my drawing. That was very exciting. And I kept going down to whenever they would have meetings. And by then I had a nice little collection of dyes that I had been doing and drawings of the mushrooms. And that's how I got acquainted with other folks who were mycologists.
Even though my mom and Miriam became part of the mycological community, what ultimately drove them was discovering new colors.
Well, Miriam was an artist and I was an artist. And we were entranced with color. And the idea was to see if we could find a complete color, what we would call a color wheel. The three basic colors in yellow, red, and blue. We always hoped to find a full range of color. You know, when she started out, the colors were all basically what we call earth colors, yellows and oranges and browns and rust and all of those colors. There was no red and there was no blue.
While they did achieve a remarkable array of yellows and browns from mushrooms, a complete color wheel still eluded them. If they could find mushrooms that created red and blue, they could have the three primary colors, and with those, they could make any color they wanted. This is the holy grail in the world of natural dyes.
Red is always a desired color for dyes because it's very difficult to find a good red that is light fast and color fast. That means it won't fade when it's washed or fade when it's in the light.
At what point did you guys stop experimenting and decide it was time to put it all together and create the first mushroom dye book?
Oh, when the publisher gave her a deadline, gave me a deadline. and said, stop right there. And at that point, we had all of the earth colors. And then one day, I got a phone call. If a phone call came through at 10 o'clock at night, it could only be Miriam, because that's the only quiet time she had in her life. And she would call me with any new experiment. And she said, Dorothy, I found a rose dye. And I said, what is it? She says, I have no idea. What is it? And she said, it was just a little brown mushroom, and I put it in the pot. And she threw in some white yarn, and it made this beautiful rose dye. And I said, well, did you save any mushrooms? She said, no, we used it all up. I said, well, I'm going to call Susan.
Susan Libonati Barnes was a friend studying mycology at the University of Washington.
And I said, Susan, Miriam's found a dye, a mushroom that makes a red dye. And she said, send it up. I said, I can't. She used it all up. And she said, scrape the pot. And she said, scrape all of the pieces off of the side of the pot, put them in aluminum foil, and mail them special delivery to us at the University of Washington, to Dr. Daniel Stuntz, who was the head of the botany department of the University of Washington. So I did that. And they looked at the shreds of these little bits and pieces of mushroom under the microscope, and they could identify by the spores that it was in the family of Cortinarius, which is a huge, huge family of mushrooms. And the book was just ready to go to print. And I called Christine Thresh. I said, hold the presses. Miriam's found a red mushroom, a mushroom that'll produce a red dye. I said, all right. And so they added in another page in the book, in the index of the mushroom dyes, and it's called the Mysterious Cortinarius. And so that was as far as we got, and then we had to cut it off there and go to press.
So before the little brown mushroom that created the rose, was that the first time that the reds and the roses were created from mushrooms?
As far as we know, that opened up a whole new possibility. And it opened up a whole new range of mushrooms that we had never thought to explore.
This is a huge jump in color range then from the yellows and the greens. And this is a whole new world of color.
This is what got everybody excited. And what's also so exciting is that these are anthraquinone dyes. Mm-hmm. So the anthraquinone pigment is extremely light fast. And Miriam sent a whole sample to a pigment expert at the University of California, and he tested all of the samples that she sent to him, comparing them with how the aniline dyes for light fastness. Mm-hmm. And he said that many of her mushroom dyes outlasted the aniline dyes. Wow. Yeah.
With the book now published, they went back to the work. New shades of red added to the large variety of yellow and green, but finding blue and completing the color wheel proved challenging.
Just because the book was finished didn't mean that we stopped doing our experiments. We were just literally getting started because of the excitement of finding the red dye. So Miriam kept experimenting and I kept experimenting, but the blue was the most difficult to find. And it wasn't until Miriam had done a lot of experimenting with mushrooms that she found in Mendocino that she discovered some mushrooms that would make blue and blue-green. And that was very, very satisfying, because there we had a complete color wheel. Because if you had red, yellow, and blue, you can make any color in the world from any combination of those. And those, with painters and with artists, are very important.
One of the challenges of the work, of course, was the sheer number of mushrooms out there. The current estimate is around 150,000 species.
And not all of them made a dye.
No, that's what I'm thinking. I don't know much about mushrooms either. So I'm just thinking of all the mushrooms that are out there and how, that's a lot of disappointment to just get the one, mushroom that would make a yellow or orange or brown.
And that's what I hear more and more from young people, some not so young, who are coming into mushroom dyeing. And their main interest is, will this mushroom make a dye? And my answer and Miriam's answer always, try it and see, because that's what she did. And she had lots and lots of experiments of mushrooms that did not make dyes. And some people call those dye duds, and other people call those the wonderful complexion colors. So it depends on your point of view. I started setting up a chromatic display of all my dyes in a little studio I had in Monte Rio. And I had a friend from high school come visit me who was a weaver and a very fine artist and very color sensitive. And I had all of my dye experiments hanging up there, as the yarns all hanging up. And the first thing she went to were all of the shades of tan and brown and things. She said, look at all the flesh tones. Look at all of those colors. And she wasn't impressed with the reds and the blues and the things like that, because those could be gotten with dyes like indigo and like madder, reds and blues. But she was very intrigued by the very subtle dyes. And she started experimenting too.
At first, my mom was swept up in the novelty of discovering new colors. But after Miriam discovered the variety of reds created from Cortinarius mushrooms, she became fascinated in the chemistry behind the color.
I was really intrigued by what was happening with the chemistry in the red dyes, and how you could have 3 or 4 mushrooms that looked absolutely identical to each other. Same colored tops, same colored gills, same colored stems. And they could make 4 or 5 different colors. And you didn't know why. My notebooks are filled with those things called mysterious Cortinarius number 1, mysterious Cortinarius number 2, number 3, number 4. Never figured out why they would make the different dyes. And then I started reading about some of the material that Susan Limonati Barnes sent me from the University of Washington, from Dr. Amarati up there, who was researching the chemistry of the Cortinarius mushrooms, and why some of the mushrooms may have 5 different pigments in them. If they were missing one of those pigments, it would never be the bright red. And he told Miriam that maybe she had found a way for differentiating the Cortinarius mushrooms by their dyes. I can remember that conversation down at Asilomar conference. Dr. Amarati was there and talking there with Miriam about that, and it was very, very exciting. And a lot of the mycologists who sort of poo-pooed the whole idea of making dyes out of mushrooms started looking at it from a different point of view, that, well, maybe the dyes have something to do with helping to identify the different mushrooms because of the chemicals that they contain.
Do you think in general do you think the scientists saw you guys as just some like artist ladies and didn't know what you're doing, or did they?
I think they did at the beginning.
Do you think the
I
scientists?
think that the scientists sort of shook their heads a little bit. The mycologists started coming around. We kept going down there. We kept showing them these colors. We kept saying, this mushroom always makes this color. This mushroom always makes that color. And they started seeing that we were bringing our own version of science to the mushroom in simply an observation, to the point that they realized that there was something very important and exciting going on about that. And they had a very high regard for Miriam and her work because of that. And more, as they saw the work spread out, began to see that there was another whole side to mushrooms than just eating them. The mycological side, there were great cooks in that group, and they were really interested in collecting for the cook pot, not the dye pot. And fortunately, I say this is sort of generally, most good edible mushrooms don't make dyes. Many of the dye mushrooms are inedible or poisonous. We were bringing mushrooms that they said, why do you bother with these mushrooms? You can't eat them. But slowly, the mycologists came around to, there was something, I would say the general group of mycologists came around to saying that there was something really special that she was doing. You know, that was the ultimate comment. When mushroom books started showing up that were referencing, oh, this one will make a dye.
But they didn't stop with the publication of their first book, Let's Try Mushrooms for Color. In that book, they had the beginnings of a mushroom dye index, a list of mushrooms and the colors they produced. With the new discoveries of red and blue and continued discovery of new dye mushrooms, Miriam was determined to expand the index into a second book and document the discovery of creating a complete color wheel using mushrooms.
And so she kept saying, let's work on our mushroom dye index and keep track of everything we're doing. And maybe we can publish another book, because she was starting to find mushrooms that made blues and more cortinarius mushrooms that all make all kinds of wonderful shades of red, rose, and orange. And so she was continuing to work with this mushroom dye index. And then in 1978, I have a baby daughter, Myra. And I was still drawing mushrooms. And that's when Miriam noticed that all of my mushroom drawings had baby mushrooms next to them. I can't imagine why. That didn't slow me down at all. I just hired somebody to babysit Myra. And we got closer to the publication of the book, and all of the copies of all of the drawings were sent to the University of Washington, and Dr. Stuntz okayed them, passed on them for accuracy.
In the meantime, my mom began sharing their discoveries with a college friend of hers who lived in Sweden, Carla Sundström, and her husband, Eric, who also happened to be mushroom enthusiasts. Through long letters and the occasional phone call, mushroom dyeing went international.
Remember, we didn't have computers in those days. We did not have internet. We did not have texting or anything like that. We had to write letters. And Carla and I would write back and forth. Every so often she would do a phone call when they found a new mushroom that would make another dye. And every time they found something, they shared it with Miriam, and Miriam shared whatever she was doing with them. And it was a very exciting time. And at the same time, Susan Libanati Barnes was getting her PhD at the University of Washington with Dr. Daniel Stuntz, and she was involved with a mycology group up there and with a whole bunch of mycologists who were finding mushrooms, and they were sending them down to us to experiment with, and they were sending copies of scientific treatises down for us to read. That would come in the mail, you know, like, this hasn't been published, please keep it to yourself. But gave us clues of where to look for other mushrooms going on. So there was this huge communication thing that was happening from all different directions.
They published the second book in 1980, Mushrooms for Color, which included a complete color wheel and an extensive index of mushrooms and their associated colors. It turns out, however, they didn't include everything.
I can remember there were a couple of mushrooms that Miriam used for a dye that made a nice green. And I made drawings of those mushrooms, and we were going to put them in the book, and some of the mycologists say, no, those mushrooms are too rare. You don't want people picking those. Those are too rare. That was one of the advantages of getting to know mycologists. We could run questions by them, and they could give us the information that we needed to know. There are also some mushrooms out there that are extremely poisonous, that make dyes, and we did not put those in the book either. So it's a matter of judgment. It's a matter of judgment.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. I didn't know that there's like the secret stash of dye mushrooms that you know about that you're not sharing. Now I really want to know what they are.
There was one mushroom, I can remember there was one mushroom when I was in Sweden, and we were drawing and we were picking mushrooms for the Swedish, to illustrate for the Swedish dye book. And Eric Sundström pointed those out to me. He says, that particular Cortinarius makes a really good dye, but it's extremely deadly and it should not be handled. So we're not going to, I was all set to start drawing it. It was beautiful. I said, no, we're not going to do that one. We don't want to be responsible for someone making a silly mistake, but even sometimes that happens. Miriam always had a disclaimer about poisonous mushrooms. And people would ask, well, if you're using mushrooms that are poisonous for dyes, does that poison go into the yarn, and then can it affect you with your skin? And I can remember we asked many mycologists that question, and they said the only way you really can poison yourself with those mushrooms is if you eat them. And so some people can get, say, contact dermatitis from just handling some mushrooms if they have very sensitive skin. And we encourage using rubber gloves and doing some of the dye things. There was some question about some of the psychedelic mushrooms, whether they would be producing dyes. And I never experimented with any of them. To tell you the truth, I don't know if anyone else has, but there was some question that they might produce, a good blue dye. But then there was the problem with advising people to go out collecting psychedelic mushrooms, which are illegal to possess. It's quite possible people have done it, but I'm not aware of it.
They're not publicly talking about collecting them and using them.
No.
I can't imagine someone who is into collecting psychedelic mushrooms would then use those mushrooms for a dye.
No. All they need to do is take the mushrooms. They can see all the colors they want. what a waste of a good psychedelic.
In the process of learning the science behind how mushrooms produced vibrant dye colors, my mom and Miriam also revisited mordants, which are metallic salts used to help bind dye pigments to fiber. The mordanting process became another piece of the puzzle linking together art, science, and their concern over the environment and safety of the dye process.
Mordants not only kept the colors fast and light fast, they changed the hues, the colors. So you could put 5 different skeins of yarn mordanted with 5 different mordants into one dye bath and get a whole range of color from one mushroom. And traditionally I had used alum, chrome, tin, copper, and iron, 5 mordants, to set the colors. And they would not only set the colors, they would slightly change the colors. And in the conversations with Dr. Eric Sundstrom, Carla's husband, he really argued against using chrome, potassium dichromate. He says that's a very deadly chemical. It's been outlawed in Sweden, and you cannot buy it, and you should not be using it for a dye. And he convinced Miriam to stop using chrome and to really question the other mordants that she was using for setting dyes. And in the middle of the second book was when she was finally decided, after talking with Dr. Sundstrom, to eliminate the use of chrome, tin, and copper as mordants and to use only alum and iron. Miriam was always interested in safety, and so she really became very adamant that people not use these other mordants.
Meanwhile, Carla and Eric Sundstrom were doing their own experiments with comparable mushrooms in Sweden.
Especially after I told her about the Cortinarius. And her husband, Eric, was an amateur mycologist. And he had grown up eating mushrooms during World War II because that was one of the few things they could find out in the woods to eat in Sweden. It was really part of survival. So he knew a lot about mushrooms, and he knew about Cortinarius mushrooms. And so they started looking for the same mushrooms too.
And were they getting similar results as here?
Yes. And these were the days before the internet. So all we had was, very few phone calls between Sweden and the United States, but we had letters. And Carla, Miriam, and I were writing letters back and forth all the time.
After the publication of Mushrooms for Color, Carla and Eric were inspired to publish a book of their own discoveries and invited my mom to illustrate it for the sake of continuity in the mushroom dye research.
Originally, they thought that they would simply translate Miriam's book, Mushrooms for Color, but they realized as they were researching that a lot of the mushrooms that we were using in the United States they did not have in Sweden, and some of the mushrooms were on the endangered list in Sweden. So they decided to do their own book.
With the publication of these books, interest in this novel use of mushrooms began rapidly spreading in the 1980s.
By then, all of Scandinavia was getting interested in the mushroom dyes thanks to Miriam. And they were forming all these mushroom dye groups all over Scandinavia, in Norway, in Denmark, in Finland, in Estonia, in England, in Scotland. It was spreading just like the mushroom mycelium. It was incredible.
As interest in mushroom dyes grew, groups of dyers and fiber artists began forming and holding symposia to exhibit their works of fiber art, exchange new ideas, and teach workshops. My mom and Miriam began traveling internationally to give talks and teach classes on mushroom dyes. Perhaps one of the most intriguing symposiums, however, was held in Australia.
And interestingly enough, there were a lot of mycologists there, a lot of dyers. We kept track of the mushrooms they used. There were only 1 or 2 mushrooms they used that they had in Australia that were anywhere else. All the rest of the mushrooms we used in Australia were new for mushroom dyes. And that was very exciting when you stop and think about the history of the world and the plate tectonics and everything, and how the continents broke apart and spread out and everything. And Australia was the one country we found that had mushrooms that none of us had anywhere else.
With the Mushroom Index complete, the second book published, and an international following, Miriam felt it was time to let others take the lead in exploration.
And I thought, finally I can get on with my life. And then Miriam said, I've discovered how to make paper out of mushrooms. I said, oh no. And Miriam was the ultimate recycler and saved everything. And she said it was just a shame to throw away all the mushroom detritus from the dyes. And so she started thinking, maybe I can make paper out of it. And she started researching how to make paper and built herself some little screens and started using all the leftover mushrooms from the dyes to make paper. And one thing led to another, and she started writing about it, and she wrote articles for Mushroom the Journal, and she started teaching classes in how to make paper out of mushrooms, and she found the best mushrooms were the polypores that grow in trees because they had chitin in them and that could hold it together much better than just plain mushrooms. And so that became a whole new thing to do. And of course, I had to try it too.
But the idea of using dye mushrooms in other mediums piqued Miriam's interest, and she began exploring how to create mushroom-based watercolors and crayons.
One day she was looking up on her shelf and she saw a little container of wax up there. She said, maybe I can make crayons. And she started experimenting with adding mushroom pigments to melted wax. And it's amazing she didn't burn the house down. And she got very excited about that, and she found different ways of using the pigments in not only wax, but in pencil clay, and she called these mycosticks. And so this was the final evolution of the pigments. She says, now I'm done, it's up to you guys. One of the things I really wanted to do was try to put all of Miriam's work together into one book. And we talked about it quite a bit.
In 1999, my mom focused her efforts on publishing a compendium of all of Miriam's work. But despite the success of the earlier books, they were rebuffed by book publishers, saying the work was too niche and didn't have a big enough audience. Undeterred, my mom, along with a friend, Susan Moresco, decided to publish it themselves and formed their own company, Mushrooms for Color Press. Without any experience of publishing a book, they gathered all the work from the earlier dye books, along with Miriam's experiments and notes for making paper and crayons, and slowly put together the third and final book, which they published in 2007.
In January 2008, we had another international mushroom dye symposium in Mendocino, California, specifically to honor Miriam's 90th birthday. And that's when the book first became available to the public.
My mom invited Christine and Robert Thresh, the publishers of the original book, Let's Try Mushrooms for Color,
to be guests, my personal guests, so they could see how far the book had gone.
For believing in Miriam in the very beginning.
And they came and they gave a talk. It was very exciting.
Over the years, my mom shared her fascination with mushroom dyes by teaching classes and workshops. She started as Miriam's assistant for the local Sonoma County Mycological Association at their annual event known as Soma Camp, and went on to teach both locally and internationally. I was lucky enough to assist her a few times and watched her relive the thrill of discovery through the excitement of her students.
Teaching dyes to people who are absolute novices, you share in their excitement and in the hands-on experience. And that's what I loved about teaching mushroom dyes. It was the same thing that Miriam would say, try it and see. And there's no one way to do anything. It has to grow, it has to keep evolving, and it still is. I see that going on to the next generation as my students, whom I've known over the many years, have had children and grandchildren, and their children become interested in the mushroom dyes and in drawing mushrooms and in recording mushrooms. So it is going on from generation to generation. Yeah, sometimes when I go back to Soma Camp or any of these other things, I feel basically like a lawn ornament with a mouth. And I see my old students who have become teachers themselves. That's really exciting.
What began as an accidental discovery in the 1970s has spread worldwide, inspired several generations of fiber artists, and spawned numerous new books. More and more people are using mushrooms as a source of natural dyes, conducting their own experiments, and making new discoveries.
And there's so much we don't know about mushroom dyes. We don't have any information at all if they were ever used in Asia, in China, in Japan, or in India. We know that some mushrooms were used for dyes back in, we found this out much later, that some mushrooms were used for dyes back in the Middle Ages in Scandinavia, polypores for yellow. There is no written record, and that's the key, a written record of dyes, of mushrooms being used as dyes by any of the indigenous peoples. That is yet to be discovered. There's very little that's been done in South America. A little bit has been done in Mexico. People are experimenting all over continually. So it's not that everything has been discovered. No, it's still alive and growing.
When I became an adult and my mom and I began dyeing together, it became clear she was more than just an illustrator for her friend Miriam. She is an encyclopedia of natural dye knowledge and anecdotes. She is a teacher and mentor. She also has a wicked sense of humor. I can't tell you how often we've cackled over a dye pot. She's also a loyal friend who wants nothing more than Miriam's accomplishments to be remembered and revered. As her daughter, I want Dorothy's place in this history also known and perhaps even celebrated. This story is about the discovery of mushroom dyes, yes, but it's also about following your heart. Do what you love. Ignore the naysayers. My guess is that when they began writing down the results of those first discoveries, Neither Miriam nor my mom knew their pursuit would take them on a journey literally around the world, creating lifelong friendships and paving the way for an entirely new field of natural dyeing. Perhaps what they say about doing what you love is true. Try it and see.